Building an indie business in the center of venture capital. I am Alex Edmonds, also known as SupremeRumHam on the internet, and this is the Building an Indie Business podcast. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about podcast apps and how they make money. They make money through people, hosting, and ads. Alright, so let's get started. So, most podcast apps are free, but they allow people to give them money for a premium service. So like I said, they have ads, so the premium service will have no ads, and it'll give users access to exclusive content or uploading your own content, or more than podcasts. Like if you have a lecture in an audio file, or like an RSS feed of audio files or of lectures, then you could upload that to the podcast player. So there's the amount they charge is different from each podcast player. So like there are podcast players that they have music, and more than just podcast music, some other things, and there are podcasts that are podcast apps that are just strictly podcasts on the platform, and those I've seen them charge around $10 a month, a year, $10 a year, yeah, and some I've seen $7, $10. The expensive ones are like $14 a month. That's crazy, dude. Okay. So every podcast needs hosting, and some of these podcast players offer hosting in order to allow people to create a podcast. And so what they do is they allow people to charge for their content, make that single podcast premium, and allow that person to charge people to listen to a podcast, and then they take a cut. So let's say I create the Open Podcast Community app, and then I allow people to host their application, to host their podcast on the app. I allow them to make their stuff private and charge users to listen. So I get a percentage of the amount they're charging every month or every episode, whatever. They can decide, and that's about 3 to 5%. Yes, and the reason why some hosting platforms do this is because it encourages the podcast hosts to promote their podcast on their platform. So I would be encouraging people to promote their show on the Open Podcast Community app, right? And so that would bring more users in to the app, and they're not just going to download the Open Podcast Community app to listen to one podcast. They're gonna listen to the podcast, right, that they paid for, but then they're gonna listen to all the old stuff that they listened to before. So it gets them to switch podcast apps, and then I could charge more for ads because I have more users than usual, right? So as the host grows, the podcast player grows. This is a little unstable to me, to be honest, because it all depends on the host. If I get someone if most of the people on the app are charging 99 cents a month, then I'm only getting like 3 cents, right? So it's not a lot of money that I would be getting based on the hosts. Yeah, but then there's the fact that I could get the next Bill Burr on my podcast app, right? So, Bill Burr has a lot of listeners, and those listeners would download the podcast, would come to the podcast app for him, and then as his podcast grows, the next Bill Burr, I get more and more users, and so that effect multiplies with every person I have on the podcast app, right? Yeah, I think so too. Good idea, Alex. So ads are based on the category that the chosen ad is in. So it's based on the categories of podcasts, and when someone is listening to a certain category of a podcast, the ad will show up. And so the ads that I've seen, they're not invasive, they're not pop-ups, they're just little like tabs at the bottom, and they say ad, and they'll like have their copy and their image of the podcast, and that's the type of clients that the podcast players have. It's podcasts, right? And so the most expensive category is business with 1,000 clicks per 1,000 cost per click. So every 1,000 clicks is $1,000. No, yeah, that makes sense. And then the least expensive category is kids and family, and that's $100 CPC, right? Okay, so what's my opinion of all this? Well, for ads, it's limited space, right? Because you have a certain amount of ad space for each category, and usually what I found is it's about 10, right? So you have 10 ads per category, and so that's actually a decent amount if you're just working on by yourself, right? As some podcast player developers are. So for business, if you have 10 slots, that's $10,000 if it's all filled up, right? And I think the other one was like $750, so $1,750 for the 10 ads. So it's not bad, right? No, $7,500. Sorry, Jesus, I think it's early. Yeah, but I also think that if there's a category where someone is struggling, or like, let's say kids and family doesn't fill up a lot, that the podcast player could have bulk discounts. So if someone buys 2 or 3 ads, it's $90 and $100. That's a 10% discount. That's pretty good, and you'd at least be filling up the ad space. It's not empty, because at least a discounted ad is better than a empty no ad, right? And then I also think that they could add more options than advertising podcasts. They could do podcast hosting platforms. Not actually, that's a bad one. Maybe like podcast microphones, right? Or podcast equipment, and that way you're expanding your potential clients. The reason why I said podcast hosting platforms is a bad idea is because that could lead to another podcast player trying to advertise on the podcast player's own app, right? So that would be cool. Because here's the thing with advertising podcasts is that there's only 1.4 million podcasts. and that's split between all the players. And there's 20 to 30 players. So that's not a lot of clients. But then, like I said, you're making a lot of money with the clients that you have now. So it all depends, right? But then again, the amount of podcasts is always growing, right? So your potential audience is growing at the same time. And then there's problems with the premium service. A lot of people, a lot of podcast apps are free already, right? Even the premium ones. So a lot of people may not be willing to pay for premium because why pay for the cow when the milk is free, right? That's what my mother always says. Yeah. But the thing with people is that's always scalable. It's a lot easier to get a person to listen to a podcast than, start a podcast. So there's 1.4 million podcasts, but there's millions of people listening to podcasts, and they might be willing to pay because they don't want to see ads, right? So that's something to think about. Okay, that's all I have for this episode. Thank you for listening. Have a nice day. Bye.